The evening air hung thick with humidity as Sarah Martinez stepped out of her Honda Civic in the dimly lit parking lot of the 24-hour convenience store. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the cracked asphalt. She had stopped here countless times during her late shifts as an emergency room nurse, but tonight felt different. Tonight, an invisible weight pressed against her chest. Sarah had just finished a grueling 16-hour shift at San Diego General Hospital. 3 cardiac arrests, 2 overdoses, and a car accident victim who reminded her too much of her younger brother. The stress of saving lives day after day had begun wearing on her more than she cared to admit. All she wanted was to grab a quick energy drink and maybe some crackers before heading home to her small apartment. The convenience store sat on the edge of a neighborhood that had seen better days. During daylight hours, it bustled with commuters and families. But after midnight, it attracted a different crowd. Sarah knew this, yet she had grown comfortable with the routine. She was a woman who had faced life and death situations in trauma bays. A simple convenience store run seemed trivial by comparison. As she pushed through the glass doors, the familiar chime announced her arrival. Behind the counter stood Marcus, a college student who worked nights to pay for his engineering degree. They had exchanged pleasantries dozens of times over the past year. Marcus looked up from his textbook and offered a tired smile. "Working late again, Sarah?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion that came with pulling all-nighters. "You know how it is," she replied, making her way toward the refrigerated section. "The hospital never sleeps." Sarah had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Navy corpsman before transitioning to civilian nursing. The military had taught her to stay alert, to read situations, to trust her instincts. But years of peaceful convenience store visits had dulled those survival instincts. She moved through the aisles with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real danger on American soil. The store was nearly empty except for an elderly man browsing magazines near the front and a woman in scrubs similar to her own examining the coffee selection. The normalcy of the scene helped Sarah relax further. She grabbed an energy drink from the cooler and picked up a bag of mixed nuts from a nearby shelf. As she approached the counter to pay, Sarah noticed Marcus seemed more alert than usual. His eyes kept darting toward the large windows that faced the parking lot. She followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Her car sat alone under one of the few working streetlights. The parking lot appeared empty. "Everything okay?" she asked, setting her items on the counter. Marcus hesitated for a moment before responding. "Probably nothing. Just thought I saw someone hanging around outside earlier. Could have been waiting for a ride." Sarah nodded, understanding his caution. Working alone in a convenience store during late hours came with its own set of risks. She had heard stories from other night shift workers about suspicious characters and uncomfortable encounters. Still, she felt relatively safe. This particular store had security cameras and good lighting. The neighborhood, while not upscale, was not known for serious crime. "Well, I'll be out of here in a minute," she said, pulling out her wallet. "Then you can get back to studying." "What class is that for?" "Thermodynamics," Marcus replied, relaxing slightly at the casual conversation. "Got a midterm tomorrow." "Well, today, technically." Sarah paid for her items and gathered her purchase. As she turned to leave, the elderly man walked past her toward the counter, and the other woman continued browsing. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The automatic doors opened with their familiar whoosh, and she stepped back into the humid night air. The parking lot stretched before her, bathed in the yellow glow of streetlights. Her Honda Civic waited exactly where she had left it, keys already in her hand. Sarah had developed the habit of having her keys ready before leaving any building, a practice that had served her well over the years. She walked at a steady pace, neither hurried nor leisurely, her nursing shoes silent against the asphalt. Halfway to her car, Sarah felt the familiar tingle of awareness that had once kept her alive in combat zones. Something was not right. The sensation started as a subtle shift in her peripheral vision, a shadow that moved when it should have remained still. She continued walking but allowed her senses to heighten, just as her military training had taught her years ago. The attack came from her right, from the space between 2 parked cars where the lighting was poorest. 2 figures emerged from the shadows with practiced coordination. They moved quickly but not frantically, suggesting experience with this type of encounter. Sarah's training kicked in immediately, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that had helped her survive dangerous situations before. The first attacker was a man in his mid-20s, thin but wiry, wearing dark clothing that helped him blend with the shadows. The second was slightly older and heavier, his movements suggesting he was accustomed to being the muscle in such operations. Both had their faces partially covered, but their eyes were visible in the streetlight. "Don't move," the thin man commanded, his voice carrying the false bravado of someone trying to intimidate. "Just do what we say, and nobody gets hurt." Sarah stopped walking but kept her keys firmly in her grip. Her emergency room experience had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others might panic. She assessed the situation quickly. Two attackers, both male, one clearly armed based on the way he kept his right hand inside his jacket. They were positioned to block her path to the car, but had left her retreat to the store open. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "What do you think we want?" The heavier man replied with a laugh that held no humor. "Wallet, purse, car keys. The usual." Sarah had been through robbery prevention training both in the military and at the hospital. The standard advice was always to comply, to give the attackers what they wanted, and avoid escalation. Material possessions could be replaced. Lives could not. She began to reach slowly for her purse, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. But something felt wrong about these particular attackers. Their positioning was too strategic, their coordination too practiced. Most opportunistic thieves grabbed what they could and ran quickly. These men seemed prepared for a longer encounter. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of reading dangerous situations, told her that compliance might not guarantee her safety. "Easy now," the thin man said, finally, revealing the weapon Sarah had suspected. The gun was a Glock, held with the casual familiarity of someone who had used it before. Nice and slow. No sudden movements. Sarah continued reaching for her purse, but her mind was racing through options. The store was perhaps 50 feet behind her. The parking lot offered little cover except for the parked cars. Her own vehicle was still 20 feet away. She calculated distances and angles the way she had once calculated the safest routes through hostile territory. The heavier man stepped closer, emboldened by his partner's weapon. "Hurry up, lady. We don't have all night." As Sarah lifted her purse from her shoulder, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The thin man with the gun was watching her with an intensity that went beyond simple robbery. His eyes held a predatory gleam that suggested this encounter might not end with just stolen property. She had seen that look before in the worst patients who came through the emergency room, in the most dangerous individuals she had encountered during her military service. "Actually," the thin man said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone, "maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." The words confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This was not a simple robbery. These men had something more sinister in mind. Her military training and civilian experience had taught her that once an attacker moved you to a secondary location, your chances of survival dropped dramatically. She would have to make her stand here, in this parking lot, under these flickering lights. "I don't think so," Sarah said, her voice taking on a firmness that surprised both attackers. The thin man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "You don't think so? Lady, you're not in a position to make choices here." He raised the gun higher, pointing it directly at her face. "Got any last words?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The man clearly expected fear, submission, perhaps begging. Instead, Sarah Martinez felt something else entirely. Years of military service, medical training, and life-threatening situations had prepared her for this moment. The scared nurse was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous than these attackers could imagine. Sarah looked directly into the gunman's eyes, her expression shifting from victim to predator. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I do have some last words." The thin man leaned forward slightly, perhaps expecting to hear pleading or promises of money. Instead, Sarah's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who had faced death before and emerged victorious. "You picked the wrong woman." The words were delivered with such quiet confidence that both attackers hesitated for a moment. In that instant of uncertainty, Sarah saw her opportunity. Years of combat training, medical emergency response, and survival instincts all converged into a single moment of clarity. The frightened woman these men thought they were robbing no longer existed. What stood before them now was something far more dangerous than they had bargained for. The transformation happened in milliseconds, faster than either attacker could process. Sarah Martinez shifted from potential victim to lethal operator with the fluid precision of someone who had trained for exactly this type of encounter. Her years as a Navy corpsman attached to SEAL teams had not just taught her to save lives, they had taught her to take them when necessary. The thin man holding the Glock made his first critical mistake. Instead of immediately pulling the trigger, he allowed Sarah's confident response to create doubt. That moment of hesitation cost him everything. Sarah's right hand, which had been reaching for her purse, suddenly changed direction. She grabbed the gunman's wrist with a grip strengthened by years of lifting patience and performing chest compressions under pressure. The movement was so fast and unexpected that the gun discharged harmlessly into the night sky. The sound echoed across the parking lot like thunder, but Sarah was already moving to her second objective. Her left elbow drove upward into the thin man's solar plexus with surgical precision, targeting the exact nerve cluster that would temporarily paralyze his diaphragm. The gunman doubled over, gasping for breath, his weapon clattering across the asphalt. But Sarah knew that disabling one threat meant nothing if the second attacker remained active. She spun toward the heavier man, who was reaching inside his jacket for what she assumed was another weapon. "Big mistake," she said, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. The heavier man had expected easy prey, perhaps a frightened nurse who would hand over her belongings and cower in fear. Instead, he found himself facing someone who moved like a professional fighter. Sarah's approach was methodical and devastating. She struck his weapon hand before he could fully draw whatever he was reaching for, then followed with a knee strike that dropped him to the ground. Both attackers were now neutralized, but Sarah's training told her the situation was far from over. The gunshot would attract attention, both from law enforcement and potentially other criminals in the area. She needed to secure the scene and ensure these men could not continue to pose a threat to herself or others. The thin man was slowly recovering his breath, but remained disoriented. Sarah kicked the Glock further away from his reach and assessed his condition with the clinical detachment of a medical professional. He was injured, but not critically. The heavier man was conscious, but clearly in significant pain from her knee strike. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "Both of you." Inside the convenience store, Marcus had heard the gunshot and was already calling 911. Through the large windows, he could see the confrontation in the parking lot, though the details were difficult to make out from his position. Other customers in the store were ducking behind shelves, unsure of what was happening outside. Sarah kept her position between the two attackers and her car, maintaining visual contact with both while listening for approaching sirens. Her military training had taught her to always have multiple exit strategies, but she also knew that fleeing the scene might make her appear guilty when police arrived. "You crazy witch," the thin man gasped, finally able to speak again. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "Actually, I do," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm messing with two amateur thugs who thought they could intimidate a woman in a parking lot. How's that working out for you?" The heavier man tried to sit up, but Sarah's stance shifted slightly, making it clear that any movement would result in further injury. Her positioning was perfect for delivering additional strikes if necessary, and both attackers seemed to recognize this fact. "This isn't over," the thin man threatened, blood trickling from his nose where it had struck the asphalt during his fall. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "For you too, it's definitely over. But let me share something about myself that might interest you." She moved closer to the thin man, close enough that he could see the complete absence of fear in her eyes. What he saw instead was the cold calculation of someone who had made life and death decisions in environments far more dangerous than a San Diego parking lot. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she said quietly, "and I spent 6 years as a Navy corpsman attached to SEAL Team 7. I've been shot at by people much more competent than you. I've saved lives under fire and taken lives when necessary. So when I tell you this is over, I mean, it's completely over. The revelation hit both attackers like a physical blow. They had expected to rob a tired nurse, not encounter a trained military operator with combat experience. The thin man's bravado evaporated entirely as he realized the magnitude of their mistake. But here's what's going to happen next, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. Police sirens are approaching. When they arrive, you're going to confess to attempted armed robbery. You're going to apologize for threatening my life. And you're going to hope I don't decide to press additional charges for attempted kidnapping. The sound of sirens was indeed growing louder, coming from multiple directions. The 911 call had triggered a significant response, as gunshots in commercial areas typically did. Sarah estimated she had perhaps 2 minutes before the first units arrived. Why? The heavier man asked through gritted teeth. Why not just give us the money and avoid all this? Sarah's expression hardened. Because you threatened to take me somewhere private. Because you asked if I had any last words. This wasn't just robbery, and we all know it. The accusation hung in the air, and neither man attempted to deny it. Their silence confirmed what Sarah had suspected from the beginning. These men had planned something far worse than simple theft, and her refusal to become a victim had likely saved her life. Besides, she added, I took an oath to protect people who can't protect themselves. What happens when you try this with someone who isn't trained to fight back? What happens to the next woman you corner in a parking lot? The first police cruiser pulled into the parking lot with lights flashing, followed quickly by 2 more units. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, trying to assess the situation. Sarah slowly raised her hands to show she was not armed, then began explaining the situation in the clear, concise manner she had learned from years of giving medical reports. My name is Sarah Martinez, she called out to the approaching officers. I was attacked by these 2 men. One was armed with a handgun. I defended myself. The weapon is on the ground approximately 10 feet to my right. The lead officer, a veteran sergeant named Rodriguez, immediately recognized the professional way Sarah was handling the situation. Her positioning, her calm demeanor, and her precise communication all suggested someone with extensive training. Ma'am, are you injured? Officer Rodriguez asked, maintaining his defensive position while his partners secured the scene. Negative, Sarah replied. Both suspects require medical evaluation. The suspect on my left may have rib damage from impact. The suspect on my right has possible nasal fracture and may be experiencing respiratory distress. Even in the aftermath of defending herself, Sarah's medical training dominated her response. She was providing accurate assessments of her attackers' conditions, ensuring they would receive appropriate care despite their attempt to harm her. Lady's some kind of soldier, the thin man muttered to one of the officers as he was being handcuffed. We had no idea. Officer Rodriguez approached Sarah carefully, noting her professional demeanor and the way she had maintained control of the situation. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide a detailed statement about what happened here. Of course, Sarah replied. But I should mention that I'm a veteran and a registered nurse. I've been trained in both combat and medical response. I used only the force necessary to neutralize the threat these men presented. As backup units continued to arrive and crime scene investigators began documenting the incident, Sarah reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated and resolved. Her attackers had expected an easy target and instead encountered someone whose background had prepared her for exactly this type of encounter. The thin man looked up at her from his position on the ground, his earlier arrogance completely gone. You could have killed us, he said quietly. Yes, Sarah agreed simply. I could have, but I didn't. That should tell you something about the kind of person you tried to victimize. As the suspects were loaded into patrol cars, and Sarah prepared to give her official statement, she realized that this encounter would likely become a turning point. Not just for her, but for anyone who heard the story of what happened when 2 would-be criminals picked the wrong target on the wrong night. Detective Maria Santos arrived at the convenience store 30 minutes after the initial 911 call. As a 15-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, she had investigated thousands of robbery cases. Most followed predictable patterns: victim compliance, successful theft, and suspects fleeing with minimal evidence left behind. This case was clearly different. The scene told an unusual story. 2 suspects in custody, both requiring medical attention. A victim who was providing detailed statements with military precision. Security camera footage that would likely show events few detectives had ever witnessed. Detective Santos approached the scene with heightened curiosity about what exactly had transpired in this parking lot. Officer Rodriguez, she called out to the sergeant who had taken the initial report. What's the situation here? Rodriguez consulted his notepad, though his expression suggested the facts were so unusual he barely believed them himself. Two suspects attempted armed robbery of a civilian. Victim fought back and successfully neutralized both attackers without weapons. Suspects are claiming she nearly killed them both. Detective Santos raised an eyebrow. Victim fought back successfully against two armed attackers? What's her background? Navy veteran, current emergency room nurse. Says she was attached to SEAL teams during her military service. Watching her handle this scene, I believe it. Sarah Martinez sat in the back of an ambulance. Not because she was injured, but because the paramedics wanted to check her vitals after such a high-stress encounter. Her hands were steady, her pulse elevated but normal for someone who had just been in combat. She answered questions with the clinical precision of someone accustomed to giving reports under pressure. Ms. Martinez, Detective Santos introduced herself. I'm Detective Santos. I need to understand exactly what happened here tonight. Sarah looked up from where the paramedic was checking her blood pressure. Her eyes were clear and focused, showing none of the typical shock or trauma that robbery victims usually displayed. Two men attempted to rob me at gunpoint. When they suggested moving me to a different location, I determined compliance was no longer a viable option for my survival. Can you walk me through your decision-making process? Detective Santos asked, genuinely intrigued by Sarah's analytical approach to what must have been a terrifying situation. During my military service, I received extensive training on survival in hostile situations. The suspect's behavior indicated this was not a simple robbery. Their coordination suggested experience, and their discussion of relocating me indicated possible intent beyond theft. Statistics show that victims who are moved to secondary locations have significantly reduced survival rates. Detective Santos had interviewed thousands of crime victims, but she had never heard one provide such a methodical analysis of their own attack. Sarah's response sounded more like a military debriefing than a trauma victim statement. So you decided to fight back, Detective Santos continued. Can you describe your actions? Sarah nodded calmly. I executed a disarming technique followed by incapacitation of both threats. My training emphasized using minimum necessary force to neutralize danger while preserving life when possible. From his position near one of the patrol cars, the thin gunman could overhear Sarah's conversation with the detective. The clinical way she described nearly destroying both him and his partner sent chills through him. During the attack, he had seen flashes of something dangerous in her eyes, but hearing her discuss it so professionally made it seem even more terrifying. She moved like nobody I've ever seen, he said to Officer Martinez, who was completing his arrest paperwork. 1 second we had her cornered, the next second I was on the ground and couldn't breathe. Officer Martinez had been a patrol cop for 8 years and had seen plenty of robbery attempts. Most victims were either completely compliant or panicked and ineffective. What made you pick her as a target? He asked. She looked normal, the suspect replied, wincing as he shifted position due to his injuries. Just a tired nurse walking to her car. How were we supposed to know she was some kind of special forces soldier? Meanwhile, Marcus from the convenience store was providing his own statement to investigators. He had witnessed the entire encounter through the store's windows and was still processing what he had seen. It happened so fast, Marcus told Detective Santos. 1 minute she was walking to her car normally. The next minute both guys were on the ground, and she was standing over them like she was in complete control. Detective Santos reviewed the preliminary statements and realized this case would likely become a textbook example of successful self-defense. Sarah Martinez had done everything right from both a legal and tactical standpoint. She had used only the force necessary to stop the threat, had not pursued the attackers after neutralizing them, and had immediately cooperated with law enforcement. Ms. Martinez, Detective Santos said, returning to Sarah's position by the ambulance. I need to ask about your military background. Officer Rodriguez mentioned you served with SEAL teams. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Detective Santos noticed a slight shift in her posture. I was a Navy hospital corpsman. During my 6-year enlistment, I was attached to various special operations units, including SEAL teams. My primary role was medical support, but all corpsmen attached to special operations receive extensive combat training. Combat training, Detective Santos repeated. Can you be more specific? Close quarters combat, weapons proficiency, survival techniques, threat assessment, and escalation management, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. The nature of special operations means medical personnel must be capable of defending themselves and their patients in hostile environments. Detective Santos was beginning to understand why 2 experienced criminals were now sitting in patrol cars claiming they had nearly been killed by their intended victim. Sarah Martinez was not just a nurse who got lucky. She was a highly trained military operator who happened to be working in healthcare. The suspects are claiming you could have killed them, Detective Santos said. Is that accurate? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. Yes. The techniques I used could have been applied with lethal force. I chose not to do so because the situation did not require it. Once both suspects were neutralized, the immediate threat was over. Even though they had threatened to take you somewhere private? Especially because of that threat, Sarah said firmly. Killing them would not have been justice. It would have been revenge. My training taught me the difference. Detective Santos made notes, recognizing that Sarah's response demonstrated exactly the kind of restraint that would make this a clean self-defense case. There would be no questions about excessive force or vigilante justice. Sarah had protected herself efficiently and stopped exactly when the threat ended. The heavier suspect, whose name was revealed to be Marcus Thompson, was being treated by paramedics for what appeared to be a bruised sternum and possible internal injuries. He kept asking the paramedics how someone could hit that hard without using weapons. She said she was attached to Navy SEALs, one paramedic explained. Those guys train their medics to fight just as hard as they do. Sounds like you picked the wrong target. Thompson grimaced, whether from pain or embarrassment was unclear. Wrong target is an understatement. That lady could have been a professional fighter. The thin gunman, identified as Daniel Reese, was having his broken nose examined and seemed more concerned about the psychological impact of the encounter than his physical injuries. She looked right at me when I had the gun pointed at her face, he told Officer Martinez. No fear at all, like she'd been there before. Probably had been, Officer Martinez replied. Military veterans, especially special operations support personnel, have usually seen worse than street punks with guns. As the investigation continued, security footage from the convenience store was being reviewed. The video clearly showed Sarah walking normally to her car, the 2 suspects emerging from between parked vehicles, the brief confrontation, and Sarah's rapid neutralization of both attackers. The entire violent encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Textbook self-defense, Detective Santos murmured as she watched the footage. She didn't start the fight, didn't use excessive force, and stopped immediately when the threat was neutralized. Store manager Jennifer Walsh, who had arrived after being called about the incident, was reviewing the same footage with amazement. Sarah shops here all the time after her shifts, she told Detective Santos. Always polite, never any trouble. I had no idea she was capable of something like this. Most veterans don't advertise their combat skills, Detective Santos replied. They just want to live normal lives. Unfortunately, sometimes normal life comes to them. By this point, word of the incident was beginning to spread among the law enforcement personnel on scene. Stories of citizens successfully defending themselves against armed attackers were rare enough, but encounters involving someone with Sarah's background were almost unheard of. Detective Santos, Officer Rodriguez called out. The suspects are asking if they can speak with the victim before we transport them to booking. Detective Santos looked over at Sarah, who had finished with the paramedics and was now sitting calmly in her car, door open, finishing her written statement. Ms. Martinez, the suspects would like to speak with you. You're under no obligation to do so. Sarah looked across the parking lot at the 2 men who had tried to rob and possibly kidnap her. Both looked significantly worse for wear, and both appeared to have lost all their earlier arrogance. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. I'll speak with them, she said, but I want officers present. Detective Santos escorted Sarah over to where Reese and Thompson were seated in the back of separate patrol cars. Both suspects looked up as she approached, and the change in their demeanor was striking. Gone was any trace of the predatory confidence they had displayed during the attempted robbery. "Ma'am," Reese said quietly, "we want to apologize. We had no idea who you were or what you could do. We're sorry." Sarah studied both men for a moment before responding. "Your apology is noted," she said finally. "But you should understand something. I'm not the only veteran in this city. There are thousands of men and women who serve their country and now work regular jobs. Some of them have families, some of them have been through trauma, and all of them deserve to feel safe in their own communities." Thompson nodded, seeming to understand the broader implications of what she was saying. "You're right. We never thought about it that way. Think about it now," Sarah said firmly. "Because the next person you try to rob might not show the restraint I did tonight." As Sarah walked back to her car, and the suspects were transported to jail, Detective Santos reflected on one of the most unusual cases she had ever investigated. It would definitely make for an interesting report, and she suspected the story would become legendary among local law enforcement. The parking lot was finally returning to normal, but the lesson of what had happened there would resonate far beyond this single night. 3 weeks after the convenience store incident, Sarah Martinez found herself sitting across from Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of emergency medicine at San Diego General Hospital. The meeting had been scheduled as a routine check-in following what the hospital administration termed a traumatic event involving an employee. Sarah knew it was really about determining whether she was psychologically fit to continue working in high-pressure medical situations. "How are you sleeping?" Dr. Williams asked, reviewing Sarah's employee file while keeping her tone professionally neutral. "Same as always," Sarah replied honestly. 7 hours a night when my schedule allows it. The incident hasn't affected my sleep patterns." Dr. Williams looked up from the file with surprise. Most people who had been through armed robbery attempts, regardless of the outcome, experienced some form of sleep disruption or anxiety. "No nightmares. No recurring thoughts about what happened." "None," Sarah confirmed. The situation was resolved successfully. Both suspects were arrested and charged appropriately. "There's nothing for me to process or worry about." This was not the response Dr. Williams had expected based on her experience with trauma victims. She had been prepared to discuss therapy options and possibly modified work schedules. Instead, she was talking to someone who seemed completely unaffected by what should have been a life-altering experience. "Sarah, I've read the police reports. You were threatened with a gun and attacked by 2 men. Most people would consider that traumatic regardless of how it ended." Sarah shifted slightly in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Williams, with respect, most people haven't been shot at by Taliban fighters or performed emergency surgery in combat zones. What happened in that parking lot was stressful, but it wasn't traumatic. It was just Tuesday night." The casual way Sarah dismissed the entire incident gave Dr. Williams insight into her employee's unusual background. The hospital knew Sarah was a veteran, but the full extent of her military experience was not common knowledge among the medical staff. "The police detective who interviewed me," Dr. Williams continued, "mentioned that you served with special operations units. Can you tell me about that experience?" Sarah had been expecting this question. Since the parking lot incident had become local news, her military background had become a topic of curiosity among her colleagues. She had always preferred to keep her service record private, but circumstances had made that impossible. "I was a hospital corpsman attached to various Navy special operations units for 6 years, Sarah explained. "My primary responsibility was medical support, but corpsmen in those units receive extensive combat training. The nature of special operations means everyone needs to be able to fight, and that training is what you use to defend yourself." "Part of it," Sarah acknowledged. "But, honestly, the medical training was just as important. I was able to assess the suspect's intentions based on their behavior patterns, just like I assess patient conditions based on symptoms. When they mentioned moving me to a different location, I recognized that as a critical escalation requiring immediate intervention." Dr. Williams was fascinated by Sarah's analytical approach to what most people would consider a life-or-death situation. "You sound like you're describing a medical procedure rather than a violent encounter." "In some ways, it was similar," Sarah said. "Rapid assessment, immediate intervention, continuous monitoring of the situation, and stopping the intervention once the desired outcome was achieved. The principles are the same whether you're saving a life or preserving your own. Down the hall from Dr. Williams's office, Sarah's colleagues were having their own discussions about the incident. News of the parking lot encounter had spread quickly through the hospital, and reactions ranged from amazement to concern about safety in the city. "Did you know Sarah was some kind of special forces soldier?" asked Lisa Chun, a fellow emergency room nurse who had worked alongside Sarah for 2 years. "She never mentioned it," replied Dr. Michael Rodriguez, one of the emergency room physicians. "But it explains a lot about how she handles crisis situations. She never seems to get flustered, no matter how chaotic things get." "I can't believe she fought off 2 armed attackers," Lisa continued. "I mean, I knew she was tough, but that's incredible." Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed she has a different way of approaching violent patients or agitated family members. She never seems intimidated or nervous." Now I understand why. Back in Dr. Williams's office, the conversation was taking an unexpected direction. Instead of conducting a trauma assessment, Dr. Williams found herself learning about capabilities she had never suspected her employee possessed. "Sarah, I have to ask about something the police mentioned. They said you could have killed both attackers, but chose not to. Can you explain that decision-making process?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Once both suspects were neutralized and the immediate threat was over, lethal force would have been unjustified. "My training emphasized proportional response and preservation of life whenever possible. The goal was to stop the threat, not to punish the attackers." "Even after they threatened to take you somewhere private?" Sarah's expression hardened slightly, the first emotional response Dr. Williams had seen during the entire conversation, especially because of that threat. "If I had killed them out of anger or revenge, I would have become something I swore never to become. Justice and vengeance are not the same thing." Dr. Williams made notes, recognizing that Sarah's response demonstrated exactly the kind of moral foundation that made someone trustworthy in life and death medical situations. "How do you think this incident will affect your work here at the hospital?" "It won't," Sarah replied immediately. "If anything, it might make me more effective. Some of our patients come from dangerous backgrounds or violent situations. Understanding what they've been through might help me provide better care." "What about your colleagues? Some of them seem intimidated by what they've learned about your background." Sarah sighed, having anticipated this concern. "Dr. Williams, I've been working here for 3 years. My colleagues know me as a competent nurse who shows up on time, follows protocols, and puts patients first. The fact that I can defend myself shouldn't change that professional relationship. But some people might see you differently now." "That's their choice," Sarah said simply. "I can't control how others react to information about my past. I can only control my own actions and professional behavior." Dr. Williams closed Sarah's file, having reached a conclusion that surprised her. "Sarah, based on this conversation and your performance record, I see no reason to recommend any changes to your work status. You're cleared to return to your normal schedule." "Thank you," Sarah replied, standing to leave. "I appreciate your concern, but I really am fine." As Sarah left the office, Dr. Williams reflected on one of the most unusual employee evaluations she had ever conducted. Instead of treating a trauma victim, she had interviewed someone who had handled a dangerous situation with remarkable competence and emotional stability. Later that day, Sarah returned to her usual shift in the emergency room. Her colleagues watched her carefully, looking for signs of change or stress, but saw only the same professional demeanor they had always known. If anything, Sarah seemed more relaxed than usual, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "How was the meeting with Dr. Williams?" Lisa asked during a quiet moment between patients. "Routine," Sarah replied, checking supplies in the trauma bay. She wanted to make sure the incident hadn't affected my ability to do my job. And had it? Sarah looked up from her inventory with a slight smile. "Lisa, last week I helped Dr. Rodriguez save a stabbing victim who coded twice during surgery. The week before that, we handled a multi-vehicle accident with 6 critical patients. In the grand scheme of things, dealing with 2 amateurs in a parking lot barely registers." The comment was vintage Sarah Martinez, direct, practical, and focused on the work rather than herself. But her colleagues were beginning to understand that their quiet, competent teammate had depths they had never suspected. Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez approached, having overheard the conversation. Can I ask you something? That night in the parking lot, were you scared at all? Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. Scared? No. Concerned about the outcome? Absolutely. But fear is a luxury you can't afford when someone is pointing a gun at your face. You have to think clearly and act decisively. Is that something they taught you in the military? They taught me that fear is information, not instruction, Sarah explained. It tells you there's danger present, but it shouldn't tell you what to do about that danger. Training tells you what to do. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, filing away another piece of insight about his colleague's unusual background. Well, I'm glad you had that training. And I'm glad you're back to work. As the shift continued, Sarah found herself reflecting on the past 3 weeks. The incident had forced her to reveal aspects of her military service that she had preferred to keep private. But she realized that her colleagues' reactions had been largely positive. They weren't afraid of her. They were impressed by her competence and relieved to know they worked alongside someone capable of handling extreme situations. During a brief break, Sarah stepped outside the hospital and looked up at the night sky. San Diego's lights made the stars difficult to see, but she could make out a few of the brighter constellations. She thought about her former teammates who were still serving overseas, facing dangers that made parking lot robberies seem trivial by comparison. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Santos. Suspects pled guilty today. Reese got 8 years. Thompson got 6. Thought you'd want to know. Sarah smiled and typed back. Thank you for letting me know. Justice served. As she prepared to return to work, Sarah felt a sense of closure about the entire incident. 2 criminals were off the streets. She had proven to herself that her training remained sharp even after years in civilian life, and her professional reputation had actually been enhanced rather than damaged. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that veterans could transition successfully from military service to civilian careers while retaining the skills that made them effective in dangerous situations. The lesson extended far beyond her own experience and would hopefully influence how society viewed and valued military service members. Walking back into the hospital, Sarah Martinez returned to the work she loved. Knowing that her colleagues now understood, she brought more than just medical expertise to her job. She brought the judgment, courage, and competence of someone who had served her country in the most demanding circumstances possible. The parking lot incident had revealed who Sarah truly was, and she was comfortable with that revelation. 6 months after the convenience store incident, Sarah Martinez received an unexpected phone call that would change her perspective on the impact of that night. The caller identified herself as Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Foster from Naval Special Warfare Command, and she had a story to share. Ms. Martinez, Lieutenant Commander Foster began, I'm calling about an incident that occurred recently during a training exercise. One of our new corpsmen cited your actions in San Diego as inspiration for how he handled a simulated hostage situation. I thought you should know that your story has become part of our instructional material. Sarah was surprised by the call. She had assumed the parking lot encounter was a local news story that would quickly be forgotten. The idea that it had reached military training facilities had never occurred to her. Can you tell me more about that? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how her experience was being used in military education. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class James Mitchell was participating in a combat scenario where he had to treat wounded while under simulated enemy fire. When the scenario became particularly intense, he remembered reading about how you maintained medical assessment protocols even during a violent encounter. He credited that example with helping him stay focused on his mission. The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Lieutenant Commander Foster explaining how Sarah's story had been incorporated into training discussions about maintaining professional composure under extreme stress. The military was using her experience to teach new corpsmen that their medical training and combat training were not separate skill sets, but integrated capabilities. Your actions demonstrated exactly what we try to teach our people, Lieutenant Commander Foster concluded. You proved that proper training allows someone to respond effectively to unexpected threats while maintaining ethical boundaries and professional standards. After ending the call, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways her story continued to influence others. She had simply defended herself in a parking lot, but Apparently, that defense had become an example for current military personnel about how to apply their training in civilian situations. The phone call came at an interesting time in Sarah's life. She had recently been promoted to charge nurse for the emergency department's night shift, a position that recognized both her clinical expertise and her leadership capabilities. Dr. Williams had specifically mentioned Sarah's ability to remain calm under pressure as a key factor in the promotion decision. "Sarah," Dr. Williams had said during the promotion interview, "we've seen how you handle crisis situations, both medical and personal. That combination of clinical skill and unflappable composure is exactly what we need in a charge nurse." The promotion meant Sarah was now responsible for coordinating care during some of the hospital's most challenging shifts. Night emergencies often involve trauma cases, psychiatric crises, and situations where clear thinking under pressure could mean the difference between life and death. Her first major test in the new role came on a busy Friday night when the emergency department received multiple casualties from a gang-related shooting. 6 patients arrived within minutes of each other, 3 in critical condition. Sarah found herself coordinating triage, directing staff assignments, and ensuring that each patient received appropriate care despite the chaos. "Room 3 needs blood products stat," she called out to Dr. Rodriguez, who was working on the most critical patient. "Room 5 is stable for now, but needs continuous monitoring. Lisa, take the patient in room 2 for CT scan as soon as imaging is available." Dr. Rodriguez looked up from his patient briefly, noting Sarah's calm efficiency in managing multiple crises simultaneously. "It's like watching a conductor lead an orchestra," he told Dr. Williams later. "She kept everything coordinated without ever seeming stressed or overwhelmed." "That's exactly why we promoted her," Dr. Williams replied. "Some people are natural leaders in crisis situations." Sarah's military background taught her how to make critical decisions quickly and clearly. The shooting victims all survived, and the emergency department's response was later cited as an example of excellent crisis management. Sarah's role in coordinating the response drew praise from hospital administration and reinforced confidence in her leadership abilities. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the shooting incident, Sarah received a visit from Officer Martinez, the policeman who had helped process the arrest of her attackers 6 months earlier. "Ms. Martinez," Officer Martinez said, "I wanted to thank you personally for something that happened last week." Sarah was puzzled, having had no recent contact with law enforcement. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. My partner and I were called to a domestic violence situation," Officer Martinez explained. The suspect had barricaded himself in an apartment with his girlfriend and was threatening to kill her. During negotiations, he kept saying he had nothing to lose because he was going to prison anyway. Sarah listened carefully, wondering how this connected to her own experience. "My partner mentioned your story," Officer Martinez continued. "He told the suspect about a woman who had been threatened by armed criminals and had chosen to defend herself without taking unnecessary life. He explained how you could have killed your attackers but chose restraint instead, and how that restraint actually led to a better outcome for everyone involved. And that helped resolve the situation?" Sarah asked. "The suspect surrendered peacefully," Officer Martinez confirmed. "He said he didn't want to be remembered as someone who hurt an innocent person when he had other choices available. Your example of showing restraint even in a life-threatening situation apparently made him reconsider his options." Sarah was moved by the story, realizing that her actions continued to have positive consequences in ways she could never have anticipated. "I'm glad the situation ended peacefully and that the woman was safe." "There's more," Officer Martinez added. "The suspect, his name is Robert Chun, asked specifically to meet with you. He's awaiting trial on domestic violence charges, but he wanted to apologize to someone who had shown the kind of courage and restraint he wished he had demonstrated in his own life." Sarah considered the request carefully. Meeting with someone involved in domestic violence was not something she had ever contemplated, but she recognized that her story might have genuine value in helping someone understand the consequences of their actions. "I'll meet with him," she decided. "If my experience can help him make better choices, then it's worth the time." The meeting was arranged through the district attorney's office and took place in a controlled environment with counselors present. Robert Chun was a man in his 30s who appeared genuinely remorseful about his actions and eager to understand how someone could maintain ethical standards even in violent situations. I read about what happened to you, Chun told Sarah during their conversation. The thing that impressed me most was that you could have killed those men, but chose not to. Even after they threatened you, you didn't let anger control your actions. Anger would have made me weaker, not stronger, Sarah explained. When you let emotions drive your decisions in crisis situations, you usually make choices you'll regret later. I wish I had understood that before I hurt my girlfriend, Chun said quietly. I was angry about losing my job, angry about money problems, angry about everything. But taking that anger out on her just made everything worse. Sarah recognized that Chin's situation was different from her own experience, but the underlying principle remained the same. The question now is what you do with that understanding. You can't change what already happened, but you can change how you handle problems in the future. The conversation continued for an hour, with Sarah sharing insights about decision-making under pressure and the importance of maintaining personal standards even in difficult circumstances. By the end of the meeting, Chin seemed to have gained perspective on both his actions and his potential for making different choices. Thank you, Chin said as the meeting concluded. Meeting you has helped me understand that being strong doesn't mean hurting other people. Real strength is about protecting people, even when you're angry or scared. As Sarah left the meeting, she reflected on the unexpected ways her story continued to influence others. What had started as a simple act of self-defense had become an example that was being used to teach military personnel, help law enforcement resolve conflicts, and encourage someone to make better choices about domestic violence. The ripple effects of that night in the parking lot continued to spread in positive directions, demonstrating that individual actions, especially those guided by training and ethical principles, could have far-reaching consequences. Sarah Martinez had defended herself against two criminals, but in doing so, she had also created an example that would influence countless others who faced their own moments of crisis and choice. Later that evening, as Sarah began her shift as charge nurse, she received a text message from Lieutenant Commander Foster. Thought you'd want to know. 3 more corpsmen mentioned your example in their after-action reports this week. Your story is making a difference. Sarah smiled and put her phone away, ready to focus on the night's work. She had never sought recognition for the parking lot incident, but she was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important lessons come from ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Her experience had proven that proper training, ethical decision-making, and personal courage could create positive outcomes even in the most dangerous situations. More importantly, it had shown that these qualities could inspire others to make better choices in their own lives. As she prepared to lead another night shift in the emergency department, Sarah Martinez carried forward the knowledge that her actions continued to matter in ways both large and small. The woman who had once asked if she had any last words had discovered that her response that night would echo forward into countless other lives, creating a legacy of courage, restraint, and professional excellence that extended far beyond a single parking lot encounter. The story of what happened when 2 criminals picked the wrong target had become something much larger, a demonstration that individual character, properly trained and ethically guided, could make a positive difference in an often dangerous world.